Oh, yeah. Okay, that's working for sure. Okay, turn to the book of Ruth. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll be looking at chapter 3 tonight, but we'll have a little bit of review to back up in the story and just remind ourselves of where we've come from so we get a feel for where we're going. But let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. We thank you for the story of Ruth and that it was in this hinge period of history, the period of the judges, right on the border of the monarchy, which began with Saul but was transferred to David. And pray that we'll get a grasp for how you were working with this family in this time of history and what it all looked forward to. And to marvel at that as we look at the lives of Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, and marvel at your hand in history, the providential work that you was evident in their lives, seeing that the decisions they made were somehow providentially um, governed, and the situations were all set up by your unseen hand. And to be impressed with that, the doctrine of providence, and to be encouraged by that in our own lives, and to see other lessons as well tonight as we study closely your word. We ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Okay, so in Act 1, which is Ruth 1, we just look at it as a series of acts in a drama or play. So in chapter 1, we have Act 1, and this is where the scene is set as a certain man moves his family to Moab, and that results in the death of this man, who was Naomi's husband. And it also resulted in the death of the husbands of Ruth and Orpah. And having heard later that there was grain in the land of Judah, Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. And she takes with her initially Orpah and Ruth, but Orpah decides along the way to return to Moab, whereas Ruth, she shows what we call kesed. It's the Hebrew for loyalty. She shows loyalty to Naomi by identifying with Naomi's people, the Israelites, and Naomi's God, Yahweh. When they arrive in Bethlehem at the end of chapter 1, scene 1, or act 1, Naomi is bitter. She had gone out full from Bethlehem, but she had returned empty to Bethlehem. And this sets what we call the complication of the book. The complication of the book is that Naomi is left without an heir and without any hope of an heir, since both of her sons are dead. It just happened to be the time of the barley harvest, and so in chapter 2 we come to Act 2, and this is the scene where Ruth has a desire to go into the fields and to glean, and she hopes to find one who will look upon her with grace. And she just happened to be gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz, who just happened to be returning from Bethlehem at that time to the fields. And he showed grace to her, a Moabite woman, and he provided economic support for her by permitting her to glean in his fields for the rest of the barley and wheat harvest. And when Naomi heard of this, she revealed to Ruth that this man was a kinsman redeemer. Now, this probably meant little to Ruth at the time, but it certainly gave Naomi hope, okay? Hope for her problem, her complication being resolved. Because for her, Boaz was a great person to fulfill this problem. But things at the end of Act 2 settle down, sort of fizzle out, and you don't really see any solution to the problem. And tonight we come to Act 3, which is in chapter 3. And Ruth had been gleaning in the field now for 2 months, and nothing had really happened. 1 month of barley and then 1 month of wheat. And so the curtain rises on Act 3, what we might call at the threshing floor. Okay, probably one of the most interesting chapters of the book. Okay, so the opening scene is the first 6 verses, and that's the daring scheme of Naomi. Okay, then Naomi, verse 1, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Okay, now this is a question that's twofold. And the first one is cause, and the second one is effect. Okay, we wonder, was it really Ruth's responsibility to seek security for Ruth? Okay, well, they lived in what we've called a patricentric culture, not patriarchal culture. Patricentric means that the father is the head of the household, and he's responsible for the well-being of everyone under his charge, okay, his guardianship. Normally, of course, that would fall to the father, but we are looking at a situation where a mother and daughter-in-law live in a home, so there is no father. In those cases, of course, this responsibility would fall to the mother, or in this case, mother-in-law. Okay, and Naomi is obviously wanting to look out for the well-being of Ruth. Okay, now whether Ruth was concerned about her well-being or not, we aren't told, but Naomi was the responsible party. Now, she wants for her security, okay? Now, this word security is from the Hebrew word for rest. It's from the same root word that we found in chapter 1, verse 9, when Naomi prayed for both Ruth and Orpah that the Lord would grant that they find rest, each in the house of her husband, okay? So the rest was defined in terms of being settled in the home of a loving husband. That's what Naomi is interested in verse 1. That's the security, okay? Now that's the cause. The effect in verse 1 would be that if she found security, that it would be well with her, okay? In other words, it was not well with her, okay? Ruth was a widow, okay? And that alone in the ancient world carried a reproach with it. But she had the other problem of destitution, not having anyone to provide food, shelter, or clothing for her. And the situation with Naomi was not going to go on forever. Naomi's much older than her, so that situation could not go on forever. The goal here, that it may be well, is the Hebrew concept of wellness or wholeness. Okay, The concept of wellness in Jewish culture involved living long in the land that was given to them, the promised land of Israel. It involved a happy marriage, prosperity, and many children. Okay? So at this time, Ruth had none of those things. She did not have wellness in the Hebrew concept. So Naomi is raising the prospect that she seek for her a husband where she can have a home and peace and be provided for. Now, this, of course, raises many questions, or it should. We're supposed to ask at this point, is what Naomi is trying to do here, is it ethical? Or is she trying to usurp the place of God? Push things and not wait on God to resolve the problem for Ruth. Because it's been 2 months now, and there was this initial excitement when she gleaned on the very first day in Boaz's field that he could be the one who solves the problem. But see, now it's been 2 months, and it's almost like she's like a little bit anxious to get the ball rolling, right? So we're supposed to ask, is what she is doing here really ethical? Should she be doing this? Or is she trying to push and accomplish God's plan for him? Okay? So in verse 2, she begins to reveal that she's got a scheme. She says, "Now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were?" Okay, kinsman. Now this is actually a fourth word that has been translated either as relative or close relative or kinsman or redeemer. Okay, so there's four different words. But without going into any detail on all this, the word simply means he's a relative. Isn't Boaz a relative? Okay. Now we already knew this, of course, but she's bringing it back up to Ruth. Okay. Now what we don't know is whether he's the closest relative or not. Okay. All we know is that he's a relative. Okay, and we know this. Naomi wants him to redeem Ruth. Okay. And then she also sort of subtly reminds Ruth of his character because she says, the one with whose maids you were. Because this man had been gracious to her, a Moabite, and allowed her to glean with his maids. Okay, so he's gracious. And wouldn't it be a good idea if we tried to kind of get the ball rolling here and get your future secure? So in verse 2b, she unveils the timing of her plan. "Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight." Okay? The word behold, you'll see this a lot in Scripture, and it doesn't mean much to us in English. Behold, behold. And nobody says that anymore. Okay, but you see it all over the Bible. It usually means something like pay attention. Okay, in this case, look. Okay? She's calling attention to an opportunity. Naomi is she's very opportunistic. Okay? Tonight, this is it. Okay? This is our last chance because the end of the harvest period was at hand, okay? So she's not going to be gleaning in the fields anymore after a few days. So we need to get this done now or we're going to lose our opportunity. This is the way this woman thinks, okay? So tonight he's going to be winnowing barley. Now let's just go through the history of this so we have a little bit of background for winnowing and harvesting. The winnowing is the last of 3 steps in the harvest, okay? So toward the end of the growing season, harvesting, okay, out of the field, threshing is step 2, and winnowing is step 3. Now these could all be taking place right at the same time at the end, okay? The harvesting simply involves going out, cutting the stalks, right, that have the heads of grain. Once they were harvested, those stalks would be bundled together and they would be taken to the threshing floor and usually allowed to dry for a period of time so that it would be easier to break free through threshing the heads from the grain, right? Then the heads would be beaten so as to get the grain loose from the head and the stalk, okay? And now you have all this mixture. You have this grain and you have all this chaff, and that would be swept up off the threshing floor, and then it would be winnowed. Okay, and winnowing is when they would take the rake, right, and they would toss it into the air, and the chaff would blow away, and the grain, which was heavier, would fall to the threshing floor. Then they could sweep it all up and do it again, right, until they got the grain completely separated from the chaff, okay? So evidently Boaz is near the end of the harvest again. His threshing floor was probably on the top of a small hill around Bethlehem. It was probably a rocky outcropping, so there's not a lot of dirt in it. Makes it easy to sweep up the grain and then winnow and keep moving on with the process. And he chooses to winnow, we're told, at night, or that night. And the reason is because typically the winds would kind of pick up in the evening, and that would make the winnowing process go quickly. And then afterwards, after the winnowing that evening, he's going to do what? He's going to go to sleep, and he's going to sleep at the threshing floor. And why is he going to do that? Why not go home? Because he's got to protect the grain. Okay? So Naomi saw this as the last opportunity for Ruth with Boaz. Okay? In verse 3, she gives the beginning of her daring plan. Wash yourself, therefore, anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. Now, this is daring, okay? The reason is because the threshing floor served many other purposes besides just threshing grain. It had a lot of social activities that took place at the threshing floor. There were judicial proceedings, there were administrative proceedings, there were business transactions, and there was even worship at the threshing floor. So the question will be when she arrives, if she goes, for what purpose is she going there? Okay? Now, Naomi didn't want to leave anything to chance. Okay? So she instructs Ruth to make herself attractive, to make herself beautiful, right? So first, by washing herself. I mean, she's worked all day in the field. She needs to take a bath. Second, anointing herself. This would be rubbing aromatic oil on the skin, what we would say the equivalent of perfume. And third, putting on her best clothes. Okay. Now, this is debated whether it's best clothes because it really just says clothes, but what she is saying is, put on something nice. Don't put what you wore out to glean in the fields on. Put something nice on, okay? And the whole thing is to make her attractive to Boaz so that nothing is left to chance. Okay, nothing is left, okay? If you're interested in a man, right? I mean, what do you want to do? Okay, well, these three things, right? This holds for yesterday, today, and forever, okay? Now, after this, she used to go down to the threshing floor. Okay, this would be outside the city of Bethlehem on a hillside somewhere near where she'd been gleaning in the fields. And once she's there, Naomi's very explicit. She says, don't make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Okay? So she's supposed to remain unannounced or incognito, something of that fashion. In verse 4, she says, it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies. And you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. Now, it's all very ominous, especially to a 21st century reader, what all this is about, okay? But the first thing that Ruth is to simply do is to take note of the location that he lied down, okay? And presumably, fall asleep, okay? Then she's to go over while he's asleep and carefully, stealthily uncover his feet so as not to wake him, okay? And it's this little expression, go and uncover his feet, that has generated more discussion than any other expression in the entire book of Ruth, okay? And the reason is because three of these terms can be interpreted in a sexual way, okay? So many interpret this as some command for some, let's say, risque sexual behavior, okay? And here's why, okay? First of all, the threshing floor was a place where illicit sexual behavior took place, especially in connection with worship. Remember, I said there's other things that take place at the threshing floor. Well, worship was one of them, and worship in the ancient Baal cult was around sexual intercourse. So, prostitutes knew that during this time of the year, men would be out in the fields sleeping to guard their grain, and they would take it as an opportunity to go out into the fields and offer them their services, okay? Hosea 9:1 speaks of this. The second reason is because the word uncover is commonly used in connection with nakedness, and I've given you 3 verses to consider, okay? Third, the word translated feet is on occasion, only on occasion, used euphemistically for the genitals, okay? And I've given you some passages that show a possible connection, okay? Now, if all 3 ideas are put together and taken in such a way, you can see how some people would say that, well, what Naomi is doing is commanding Ruth to engage in some risque behavior, okay? But there are several reasons this is highly unlikely, okay? First, the words by themselves do not require a sexual interpretation. Uncover can simply mean uncover. especially when it's not in connection with any sexual term. And there is no description here necessarily of that nakedness, okay? Feet can simply mean feet, and the other use of the word in Daniel 10:6 is contrasted with the arms and hands, so it seems clearly to just refer to the feet and nothing more, okay? Second, later in verse 8, when the man does wake up and he beheld the woman, she was lying at his feet. Well, if feet meant genitals, then she was lying on his genitals, but I don't think that's a likely interpretation. Okay? Third, a sexual interpretation does not fit the character of Ruth or Boaz, who are portrayed throughout the book as very virtuous, right? Fourth, her actions were commended by Boaz in verse 10 as an act of kindness, okay, which again is the Hebrew word chesed, which we said means loyalty. So what she did was viewed by him as an act of loyalty, not to him, but an act of loyalty to her dead husband. So nothing promiscuous was taking place. And in verse 11, he refers to her as a woman of excellence, something we'll look at more later, okay? But that wouldn't fit if there was anything promiscuous taking place. And fifth, Naomi's goal, expressed in verse 1, back in verse 1, was that Ruth find security, right, in the house of a loving husband, okay? If she were going up like a prostitute, that would hardly be a good way to achieve that goal, okay? So the phrase, go and uncover his feet, is really more innocent, and it's just designed to result really in a second encounter between her, Ruth, and Boaz, okay? So Naomi closes her instruction in verse 4 with the words, then he will tell you what you shall do. But what's interesting later is she tells him what to do. And so that it will get very kind of interesting on the threshing floor, okay? So after 53 words now in the Hebrew text, 53 words of instruction, Naomi really thought this out. She had every detail covered, okay? Now, in the next verse, verse 5, Ruth responds with just 4 Hebrew words. Translated, all that you say, I will do. Again, all this is saying and showing us is the character of Ruth, right? That this woman has chesed. She is loyal to Naomi, and she is willing to enter into a role that is pretty daring, because Boaz doesn't know what's going on. The guy's going to be asleep, and then what's happening? Okay, so it's pretty daring. Now in verse 6, she did exactly as she said. So it says, so she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law commanded her. Okay, that's the end of scene 1. Okay, the curtain closes on scene 1. Naomi's daring scheme is now in the open. We know what it is. And so Ruth bathed, she put on her perfume, she put on some nice clothes, she went down, she remained incognito until after he finished, and then we come to scene 2, the curtain rises in verse 7, and we're at the threshing floor, okay? And here we go through the details. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down, okay? Now, it says his heart was merry. Now, it doesn't mean that the guy was drunk, okay, but it meant that he was fully satisfied. His belly was full, and he probably was enjoying some of the pleasant effects of wine. So now it was time to retire, okay? Now, he went to lie down, it says, at the end of the heap of grain. So this is Ruth taking note, as she was told to do, where he lay down. Because, see, there's other men that were going to be sleeping out in the fields. She needs to go to the right guy, okay? So she took note. When she was convinced the guy was asleep, what did she do? She came secretly and she uncovered his feet and lay down. Now, the Hebrew is very ominous. It's like it speaks ominously here, and it's like it's a stealth operation, okay? She has to go over there and she has to uncover his feet while he's asleep so he doesn't wake, because if that's the case, he's going to think that it was on purpose, like a prostitute might do. But this is supposed to take place in a certain way, okay? So she then uncovered his feet, and she just lay down beside him very quietly. Now in verse 8, it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled, and he bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. Now this has to be translated correctly. The term middle of the night is midnight. So technically it's really midnight. So several hours probably have passed with the guy's feet uncovered. And then it says he was startled. Okay. This is the word. Okay, this word actually means trembled, or what we might say, shivered. He shivered. Why did he shiver? Well, because his feet got cold. Okay? That's why he woke up. He woke up because his feet got cold. He bends forward. What's he doing? He's going to get the blanket and put it over his feet. When he does this, it says, behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And there it is, behold. It's an element of surprise. Like, what? Who's this? Okay? And that's what he asks in verse 9. Who are you? Okay? Now, he didn't use a gender-neutral term, you here. He uses a feminine term. Who are you? Feminine. He knew it was a woman. How he knew, we don't know. Maybe he could have made out her form slightly, but more likely he smelled her perfume. Okay. And she answered, I am Ruth, your handmaid. Okay. But then she did something that a handmaid, especially a Gentile handmaid in the land of Israel, should not do. And that is, she makes a marriage proposal. She proposed to this guy. She said, so spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative, okay? Or a goel, a kinsman redeemer. Now, this is a marriage proposal, and it was obviously understood by Boaz to be a marriage proposal, okay? Whether we would understand it that way or not in the 21st century, he understood it. The word covering here, so spread your covering, is kenape, okay, from kanap, and it means wings. Spread your wings over your maid, okay? Now, if you just briefly turn back to chapter 2, verse 12, 2:12, you'll see this exact same word was used when Boaz prayed for Ruth. He says, pray that, or bless that the Lord would reward her work, that her wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel. And then he says it, under whose wings, same word, wings, she had come to take refuge. So what does it mean to come under one's wings? It means to come under and take refuge under another. That is, to be protected by another. So what Ruth is telling him to do, she's not asking, by the way. She's telling him, okay? Telling him to do is to give her protection, okay? And that's an indirect way of saying, marry me, okay? Marry me. Now, if you can imagine that's not the conventional way to do it in the 21st century, surely you can imagine this was not the way to do it in ancient Israel, okay? Of course, it was usually the man who proposed to the woman, okay? And this one is particularly unusual because the two are of a different social class, or social status. They had different statuses in their world. He's a wealthy landowner. She's a poor handmaid, okay? Not only that, though, they have different national status, okay? He's a Jew and she's a Moabite, okay? So the request is coming from a poor foreign Moabite to a wealthy Jewish landowner, okay? But that's what Naomi intended, right? In verse 1, that's what Naomi sought for Ruth, was that she would find security, that she may have wellness in the Hebrew concept, okay? And so she says, she's saying, marry me, okay? Now, at the end of the marriage proposal, she tacks on the reason she's proposing to him and not somebody else. She says, for you are a close relative, okay? Now, that's the same word used in 2:20, the very end of 2:20, which we said was goel. And the goel is the redeemer. That is the Hebrew word for redeemer, okay? She says, for you are a redeemer. I want you to marry me because you're a redeemer, okay? Now, what about this term? Let's say a little bit more about this term. This was a term in Israel's family law that referred to the duty of a male relative of a deceased husband who left a childless widow behind to redeem her from childlessness through marriage and raise up offspring for him. Okay, now we're going to get to the verse here in a minute in Deuteronomy 25 that's closest to what happens here. Although what I want to show you is that there's actually not any part of the law of Moses that puts any legal necessity on Boaz doing anything. Okay. A lot of times the book of Ruth is taught, and it's assumed that he's following a law in the Old Testament, but he's not. Okay. I'm going to show you that he's not. Okay. And this is actually really, really important for the typification with Messiah in the future and why he's doing what he's doing, okay, as far as redemption is concerned. So she makes this proposal to him saying, you're a redeemer, okay? Now, she doesn't say you're the only redeemer. She just says, you are a redeemer, okay? Okay. Now, we're going to find out later there's somebody who's closer. There was a closer redeemer than Boaz, right? But what's really, really important is to understand what I just said, is that there are only 5 instances in the whole Hebrew Bible where a kinsman redeemer was legally required to intervene in something. So let's go through those 5, and let's see if any of these match the situation here of Ruth, okay? The first one is Leviticus 25, 25 to 30. And this teaches that if there's an Israelite man who becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then the nearest redeemer, the nearest kinsman redeemer, was to come and buy the property and restore it to the man. Okay? And of course, if there was no one to do it, and he couldn't come up with the funds himself, then in the year of Jubilee, the land returned, right? The land was restored. But there's a situation where a nearest redeemer would come in and buy the property and restore it to his fellow family member. That's one case. Second case is Leviticus 25 again, verses 47 to 55. So I've just summarized these. I'll read these and summarize them. If an Israelite man became so poor that he had to sell himself into slavery, then a kinsman redeemer could purchase his freedom. Okay? Purchase his freedom. Otherwise, he would, again, serve till the year of Jubilee, and then he would be released, right? The third case that required a kinsman redeemer was if a man committed murder, the redeemer of the murdered man would track the murderer down and slay him, okay? So that's Deuteronomy 19, 11 to 13. 3 cases where kinsman redeemer would come into the picture. The fourth case is Numbers 5, 5 through 8. Here's where a redeemer could receive restitution money for a deceased victim of a crime. So the victim couldn't receive the money because they already died, but a kinsman redeemer could receive the restitution. Okay. And then the fifth case is Jeremiah 50:30, described in Jeremiah 50:34, and that's where a redeemer was responsible for ensuring a fair trial that involved a relative. Okay, making sure you go to the court proceedings and everything is done justly. Okay. Now, are any of those even remotely close to Ruth's situation? A man becomes poor, has to sell his part of his property. A man is so poor he sells himself into slavery. A man commits murder. No. Okay. Number 4, receiving restitution money. No. Responsible for ensuring a fair trial. No. Okay. Those are the only cases that bring in the concept of a goel in the whole Old Testament. Now, since none of these apply, there's only one text that gets close to approximating what happens here, but we'll show when we go into chapter 4 that even it doesn't fit entirely, okay? This is the practice in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, number 6 I have listed here. In this passage, if a man dies and his wife has no sons, then the man's brother should marry her and raise up offspring for his brother, right? This is probably the one you're more familiar with than any of the others, okay? But even here, there's no mention of a goel. The person is not referred to as a goel, they're referred to as the brother. It was the brother. The brother was the one who was responsible to do this, not some other kin, okay? So in the case of Ruth, okay, she was married to a guy named Mahlon, right? And Mahlon had a brother named Kilion, right? And what happened to Mahlon and Kilion? Well, remember, they died, right? They died. So, there's no legal provision under Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10 for Ruth because there was no other brother that was a son of Naomi to marry her, right? So this marriage proposal that she's making to him really has no legal basis, okay? But here's the deal. If we know Boaz's gracious character from chapter 2, and if we know he's a man who fulfills not just the letter of the law, remember, but he's a man who fulfills the spirit of the law, then we can begin to predict how he's going to respond to her proposal. So let's see it, verse 10. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now it is true, I am a close Goel. However, there is a Goel closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." Okay? Now, verse 10 must have been, what he says there must have immediately set her at ease. He pronounces the Lord's blessing upon her because she has shown this kindness, this last kindness, to be better even than the first. Okay? Now, what is this kindness? Well, this kindness is the Hebrew word kesed again. And you kind of wish after a while, don't you, that they would just always translate this the same. So you as an English student of the Bible could just read through, and every time you saw that word, you would know this is the same word, okay? But we've been taught in creative writing to make a new word every time and blah, 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 blah. And translators sometimes inherit these bad habits. When in this case, it would be helpful to know it's the same exact Hebrew term. This term, kesed, means loyalty demonstrated by acts of devotion. Loyalty demonstrated by acts of devotion. He's saying the first act of loyalty that you gave toward Naomi was great, okay? But this last loyalty is even better. Now, what is her last loyalty? What is this loyalty that Boaz is speaking of? Who is she being loyal to? Her dead husband, Mahlon. Okay? That's her loyalty. And Boaz recognizes this woman is loyal even to her deceased husband, okay? So, this loyalty is loyalty to the integrity of family, okay? Now, this is divine institution number 3, family, right? We have divine institution number 1, which is responsible labor to God. Divine institution number 2, which is marriage, okay, between one man and one woman. And divine institution number 3, okay, the family, or what comes out of marriage. And she has a high respect for divine institution number 3, the integrity of the family unit, okay? Now, she could have gone off and married any young man, rich or old. Boaz says that, right? Okay? She was an eligible bachelorette, okay? Okay? But if she had gone after someone outside of the family, well, then she would not have preserved the integrity of this family, okay? So that's why he says your last loyalty is better than your first. And that is what impressed Boaz, okay? And all men have to ask themselves, who wouldn't want to be married to a woman like this, right? Who shows that kind of integrity and that kind of loyalty to the family. So in verse 11, he shares his intention now, having been proposed. "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence," okay? So immediately he calms her. He says, don't fear, okay? And then, look, this woman had many reasons to fear, okay? As a woman in that culture, she had no long-term economic plan for supporting herself and Naomi. Now she's gone out on a limb here, and she's kind of proposed to Boaz, who's way out of her social class and a foreigner. Okay, So a lot of things could have gone terribly wrong on the threshing floor. So he just immediately calms her fears, okay? And then he assures her, hey, look, I will do for you whatever you ask, okay? Remember I said earlier, Naomi said, when he wakes up, you just do whatever he tells you to do. And I said, isn't it interesting that she's the one that told him what to do? She said, cover me with your wings. She didn't ask him to do that. She told him, okay? Now, and now look what he says to her. I'll do whatever you ask. Now that's the response of a servant. Whatever you ask, I will do. I'm your servant, okay? Now, this is a reversal of the social structure. Usually it would be him telling her what to do, okay? But now the lesser is going to be telling him, the greater, what to do, okay? But this reveals the servanthood of Boaz. Boaz is a servant. Now, who is Boaz? Now, the Bible doesn't come along and say Boaz is the type of Christ. Okay, I understand that. We can talk about patterns, illustrations, types, and all that later. But most people recognize there are a lot of characteristics of Boaz that typify and look to an antitype in the Messiah, right? Well, here's one. This guy is a servant, right? Whatever you ask, I will do, right? And what is the Messiah? Isn't he a servant? He says, I did not come for you to serve me, but I came to serve you. To offer himself up as salvation, right? To give us salvation, okay? So Boaz typifies Messiah who came to serve us, not because of legal necessity, but here it is. Because remember, there's no law that Boaz has to do this. Boaz doesn't have to marry her, okay? He does it because of what? Amazing grace. And that's why the Messiah served us. There's no legal necessity for him to come and do all that. Okay? But he does it because of amazing grace. Now, in the middle of verse 11, he adds this. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Okay? Now, how long had she been in Bethlehem? Since the beginning of barley harvest. How long ago was that? About 2 months. And you're telling me already everybody in the city knows this woman's character is most excellent? See? Yeah, they knew. Okay? Because why? Because first of all, they'd all heard of her loyalty to Naomi. Okay? And secondly, because they'd heard of her industriousness in the field of Boaz, right? So they know this woman is a woman of excellence, okay? Now this expression, woman of excellence, is something like woman of noble character or a noble woman. Actually means woman of strong character. But this phrase is only used 3 times in the Hebrew Bible. Here, of Ruth, and then twice in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 12:4 says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, and contrasts it with a woman who brings shame on her husband, who is like rottenness in his bones. And then Proverbs 31:10, the most well-known Proverbs of all, where we have an acrostic, right, that praises the excellent wife, okay, as one whose worth is far above jewels. And it goes on to describe her as a woman who trusts her husband, a woman who does good to her husband all the days of his life, a woman who works hard to provide food in the home and provide clothing for her family, and looks forward to what the future holds for them, okay? And a woman who is blessed by all her children, okay, as a woman who fears the Lord. That's the Proverbs 31 woman in summary. And the rabbis, now not all canons place Ruth after Proverbs, but the rabbis place Ruth after Proverbs in what's called the Ben Asher tradition of the Hebrew canon, because they recognize in Ruth the embodiment of all that the Proverbs 31 woman was as an excellent wife. Okay, in their eyes, Ruth was the most excellent wife, which is interesting because she was a Gentile or a Moabite, right? That doesn't mean to me that I think that it actually was her that King Lemuel was writing about. King Lemuel was actually writing down a proverb that was given to him by his mother. Okay, but at any rate, she certainly does fit the proverb. Okay, now having stated that he will do all that she asks, whatever you want, because she's an excellent woman, a Proverbs 31 woman. In verses 12 and 13, he reveals his plan. He says, now it is true that I am a Goel. However, there's a Goel closer than I. Okay, there's a closer Redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer laws require that the closest Redeemer be given the opportunity to redeem first. Okay? So now we come to a second complication in the story. The first complication is chapter 1, right? Naomi has no heir. Now, all of a sudden, she's going to get this guy. She is on a mission. Put on your best clothes, take a bath, put on your perfume, go down there, you're supposed to be looking hot, okay? And we're going to get this guy. Do this little thing. Uncovers feet, da-da-da-da, wakes up, okay, you get to talk, okay? And you're going to sort this out. Marry me, she says, right? Now, all of a sudden, we're like, whoa, this may not happen now. There's somebody else who is a closer redeemer, okay? So this is the second complication, okay? And we have to figure out later if these legal complications can be overcome, okay? And he can marry her. Now, it's not the way we want the story to turn out that it doesn't happen, okay? But in verse 13, Boaz does introduce a backup plan. He says, remain this night. When morning comes, if he will redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. Okay, so lie down until morning. So he says, lie down or remain this night. Okay, it's probably dangerous. Remember, this was the time of the judges, right? There's a lot of men out in those fields. Okay, and it's about midnight. There's not much the good that goes on past about 10. So, in a day and period when every man did what was right in his own eyes, you don't send the girl packing at midnight. Okay, well, you might send her packing, like packing, but you don't send her home, okay, without packing. He says, remain here, okay? And then he says, when morning comes, I will take care of this legal complication, okay? And if the Goel wants to redeem you, that's good, okay? That means you'll be given security. You'll protect the integrity of the family, okay? Divine institution number 3. But if not, he says, I'll redeem you, okay? And everyone is supposed to be cheering for Boaz. Boaz, Boaz, Boaz. I don't want this other guy, whoever it is, okay? And the statement at the end of the verse shows his commitment. He says, as the Lord lives, this is what I will do, okay? And then he just says, okay, so he repeats, lie down until morning. It was a safety issue, okay, that's all. Now, it's unlikely that from this point forward in the night, either one of them really slept. Boaz, he's preoccupied with resolving the legal complication the next morning with Mr. Whoever, okay? And Ruth, she's preoccupied with what's going to be the result of this legal decision, and how am I going to get away from the threshing floor without anybody noticing me, okay? So in verse 14, she lays at his feet until morning, and she rose before one could recognize another. So a little bit before dawn, right? And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Okay, so he was still awake. She gets up quietly, I'm sure, and he's still awake. And nothing sinful had taken place, okay, but he wants to make provision for her to go under cover of darkness, okay, because you know how people are. If it just looks like it, it must have happened, And this could damage both of their reputations, okay? So he wants her to get home before cover of dark, okay? But this is not enough. He adds in verse 15, now give me the cloak, or it's really a shawl. Give me your shawl that's on you and hold it. So she holds it, says she held it tightly, and he measures 6 measures of barley, and he laid this shawl with barley in it on her, okay? Then she went into the city, okay? Now this was 6 measures of barley, okay? It doesn't say the unit. Usually like earlier in the chapter, or earlier in the book, we saw that he had given her an ephah of grain, an ephah. And we worked that all out. It was equivalent to a bath. It was 5.8 gallons, but it was a dry measure, about 30 pounds. Now, if it was 6 ephahs at 30 pounds each, that's 180 pounds. There's nobody in the room here that could carry that in a shawl, okay, all the way to the town of Bethlehem, okay? So it's probably not an ephah. Now, there was a measurement that's a 1/10 of an ephah. That was called an omer, okay? And since it's 1/10 of an ephah, then each one's about 3 pounds. 3 times 6 would be 18. This is reasonable, okay? And that's probably the size of the scoop. So you take the scoop, it's about 3 pounds of barley, and put it in the shawl. And you did that 6 times, okay? 18 pounds, wrap it up, throw it over the shoulders, send her to town. Okay? Packing. Always packing. Now, but the Masoretic text actually says he went into the city. It doesn't say then she went into the city. And so people have really struggled over this. I think they both went to the city, okay? I don't know which one is intended here. I can't resolve it, okay? Because you've got the Latin, and you've got another to say she, and then you've got the Masoretic which says he, okay? But Boaz was certainly eager to go to town and just resolve the legal issue. He said he would do it that morning. So he went to town probably. She went to town, but they didn't go together. We know that, okay? And then the curtain falls on scene 2, the threshing floor meeting, right? And scene 3 opens, the curtain rises, and here we have the report when Ruth is back at home with Naomi. Verse 16, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did it go, my daughter?" Okay? But the question in the Hebrew is different. That's not what it says. That's an interpretation. It's not a translation. The translation is, "Who are you, my daughter?" As if she didn't recognize who it was who'd walked into the door. And that's very possible because it was still dark. There was still cover of darkness. It's very possible because, well, she had this shawl covered in, or full of grain, so that could have changed her figure, okay, if she could see her, okay. So the point is, Naomi may have just woken up too. Like, who are you? You can't see very well. So she's asking, who is she, okay? And Ruth doesn't tell her, but she just begins to tell her what happened, okay? And in verse, it says that she told her all that the man had done for her, okay? But I just found it so interesting that verse 17, she doesn't even mention anything explicitly about what he had said or done or anything like that. She just gets straight to the barley. She said, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Okay? And so she gives the food report, and we're like mostly not interested in that. Okay? But what does that tell us? And what does it tell Naomi about Boaz? Boaz has greater concerns than just marrying Ruth. Okay? He has concern to preserve this family's integrity. What's so striking about this chapter is it's not about romance and all of that kind of stuff that we want to think is here, seduction, some kind of game going on and all this kind of stuff. But the high value that both of these individuals put on the integrity of the family, okay, and that loyalty, okay. So here is the food, okay? You're going to get provided for. In verse 18, Naomi, still concerned about Ruth and her security, says, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today." Wait, this is the concept of sit down. That's what she's saying. Apparently, Ruth is like pacing up and back across the floor. And she says, just sit down. It's going to be okay. There's no reason to worry. Boaz is going to settle this. Okay? And what's striking is that Naomi, who was so uptight at the beginning of the chapter, to the point she's got every little detail in this plan worked out, right? So this cannot go wrong, right? She's quite relaxed now. She's quite relaxed. Just relax, she says. Sit down. It's going to be worked out today. It's as if she already knows. The providence of God has been at work through the meeting at the threshing floor, and all is going to be well. This woman is transitioning. She's the only one in the book whose character develops, right? She goes out full, right, from Bethlehem. She returns after 10 years in Moab empty, and she's bitter, right? But she's sweetening up now. She's sweetening up. Why? Well, because she's seeing that God is loyal, that he's Kesed. She's seen it in Ruth, she's seen it in Boaz, and now she's starting to see it in the Lord. See? Okay, and with this, the curtain falls on Act 3, and we are left in the same shoes as Ruth in the end of verse 18. We're wondering, how is the matter going to turn out? Okay, so in summary, this chapter describes Naomi's dangerous scheme, okay, for Ruth to acquire security. She's going to go bathe, she's going to put on the perfume, the nice clothes, get down to the threshing floor incognito, watch where he lays down. And after he's fallen asleep, approach him, uncover his feet, and wait for him to tell her what to do, which she did, okay? But when he awoke, He asked who she was. She told him, and she told him what to do. Spread your wings over your maid, meaning marry me, okay? Because you're a redeemer, okay? Remarkably, Boaz said he'd do whatever she said. He's a servant, right? He's a servant. Because she's an excellent Proverbs 31 woman. But there was one complication that comes into the picture, right? Boaz is not the closest redeemer, okay? But he's going to get up the next morning. He's going to resolve the issue. And if that closest redeemer doesn't redeem her, he promises, as the Lord lives, that he will. And so she remains until morning under cover of darkness, returns to Bethlehem. He goes too. She's got her 18 pounds of barley for Naomi. Naomi's relaxed now because she sees the providence of God. And she knows it's all going to be solved that day. But we have to wait in suspense till next week, okay? And then we get to discover what the book is ultimately all about, what it's really all about, okay? So what can we learn? I've chosen 3 things. There are probably more. But first of all, the theme of providence continues, okay? Providence is this idea of the unseen hand of God reaching into and working through the details of a person's life to bring about some remarkable conclusion that they can't see yet. Okay? The unseen hand of God working in and through the lives of individuals to bring about some remarkable conclusion that we can't see yet. See, providence is in this chapter because Naomi's scheme was very dangerous. It could have gone a number of different ways. Okay? Boaz could have taken her as a prostitute. Okay? He could have taken this gesture as, an invitation to intercourse or something. This was not orthodox, what this woman did either in her proposal. To propose marriage to someone like this, a wealthy Jewish man, that was not orthodox. That could have gone pretty bad. Okay? But remarkably, Boaz's response was very, very positive. Okay? And I presume that in our own lives, God's providence is at work too. We can't see it any more than they could probably see it until they got close to the end. We can't see it until we get close to the end or we're at the end. But it's just like Joseph, right? The Joseph story. I mean, do you imagine how bitter that guy could have become? Being in prison for over 700 and something days, over 2 years. His brother sold him into slavery, left him for dead, then sold him, we can make some money, let's sell him. Right? Then he gets thrown in prison. Then the baker says, oh yeah, I'll come back, I'll remember you. Never remembers him. Like, are you kidding me? The guy could have got bitter. But by the end, he realized that God meant it for what? Meant it for good. He says, you meant for evil to his brothers, but God meant it for good, the saving of many lives, right? See, our lives are like that, and we can become bitter, okay, because God lets this and this and this happen in our lives. We don't like it, right? Don't be a Naomi and get bitter, right? See these stories and remember that God has an end, and that end is good, okay? Second thing, the theme of fulfilling the spirit of the law, not just the letter of it, right? Boaz had no legal obligation to redeem Ruth. There's no redeemer. There's no Goel laws related to this, okay? But this man was godly. He loved God, and that meant he loved other people, okay? He saw a need, and what did he do? He met the need, okay? Or at least he put himself out there and said, I will. If this other guy won't resolve it, I will resolve it, okay? And that's the way we should be, right? I mean, are we really godly people? Do we really love God? Or are we just like, well, the Bible doesn't require that of me, so I'm not going to go that far? He could have very well said that. I'm not required to do anything here. See, and there's a lot of times we're not required to do anything. But the question is, do we love God? Okay, and do we love people so that we will go beyond what is required and meet a need? Okay, simply because we love the Lord. And the third thing that we've seen, of course, is the high value of divine institution number 3, the family. See, because the family is the basic unit of society. The Old Testament is very, very strong on family and preserving the family intact, preserving the land of the family, the property, right? And of course, our society is set up to destroy the family now with property taxes and all that. Okay, but they didn't have that. Okay, with property tax, inheritance tax, they didn't have none of that. Okay, because the basic unit of ownership was the family, right? And so if changes hands, mom and dad die, and the property goes to the sons, there's been no transfer of legal ownership because it was the family's property, right? Okay. She recognized, of course, the high value of family, okay? She's loyal to Naomi, okay? She's loyal to her dead husband, okay? And Boaz recognizes it too, okay? They're both trying to preserve the integrity of the family. The question is, do we have that kind of dedication to family? Okay? I mean, the issue for Ruth, as you can see very clearly, was not her happiness. It was not her happiness. That's not what she was going after. What she was going after was loyalty. Loyalty. Loyalty trumps happiness in family and in marriage, okay? But here's the deal. Here's what's interesting. If you learn loyalty to family and to marriage, guess what? You'll find the most happiness you can find in a fallen world. But loyalty has to come first. Okay? All this stuff about happiness, you can forget it. Okay? Unless you learn loyalty, you can never find it. Okay? God will not be mocked. Okay? This is the way He's designed the universe. And we either conform or we just get frustrated. Okay? All right, great lessons. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to look at this fantastic chapter and see the marvels of your providence as you work through these people's decisions to work toward a designed end, which you had in mind, which we have yet to see. And we pray, Lord, that we would be fascinated by what you are accomplishing in these people's lives. And also when we realize that, hey, you're doing the same things in our lives. We can't see the end, okay? But let us not become bitter before the end. Let us wait and hold out and trust that you have something very much better in mind, something that we could never fabricate, something marvelous for each of our lives, some contribution. And we give thanks to you that you are working our lives in such a fashion. In Jesus' name, amen.